Dear beloved viewers, we want to sincerely apologize for the recent technical errors that caused a few of our latest videos to be published without sound. We know how much you value these stories, and we are truly sorry for the disruption and disappointment this may have caused. The issue has now been fixed, and we're taking extra care to ensure it never happens again. Thank you for being here with us. With deep gratitude, Unknown Stories team. The clicking of expensive heels against polished linoleum echoed through the hallway like tiny hammers, driving nails into Clara Wilson's heart. Her weathered hands trembled as she clutched her small suitcase, the only possession her daughter had allowed her to bring. At 76, Clara's pale blue eyes still held the clarity of youth, now clouded only by the unmistakable sheen of betrayal as she watched her daughter Eleanor's retreating back. No goodbye kiss, no proper hug, just a dismissive wave and a cold smile that never reached her eyes. "You'll be comfortable here, Mother," Eleanor had said, her voice carrying the practiced smoothness of the high-powered Chicago attorney she'd become. "It's exclusive, the best care money can buy." Clara glanced around the sterile lobby of Lakeview residence, noting how the expensive furniture and tasteful art couldn't mask what this place truly was, a warehouse for unwanted parents. A young nurse approached with a clipboard and a smile, too bright to be genuine. "Mrs. Wilson, let's get you settled in your new home." Home. The word stuck in Clara's throat like a fishbone. Home was the small apartment where she'd raised Eleanor alone after her husband died. Home was where she'd skipped meals so her daughter could eat. Home was where she'd sung lullabies and bandaged scraped knees. Home wasn't this place that smelled of disinfectant and despair. As the nurse led her down the corridor, Clara's fingers instinctively touched the modest pearl pendant hidden beneath her blouse, the only piece of jewelry she'd refused to sell during those difficult years. The pearl held a secret that even Eleanor, with all her legal brilliance, had never discovered, and perhaps now it was time for secrets to come to light. 3 months earlier, Clara had been perfectly content in her modest apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. The building wasn't fancy, but it was hers, paid for with decades of honest work as a secretary by day and cleaning office buildings by night. After Robert died when Eleanor was just 7, Clara had poured everything into raising their daughter. "You're smart as a whip, Ellie," she would say, rubbing ointment onto her own cracked hands after a long day. "Study hard. I'm saving for your college." And save she did. Every penny counted. Clara sold her wedding ring when Eleanor was accepted to an Ivy League law school. "I don't need the ring to remember your father," she told her tearful daughter. "What he'd want most is for you to have your chance." "One day, Mama," Eleanor had promised, hugging her fiercely at the airport. "I'll pay you back for everything." But as Eleanor's career soared, first at a prestigious firm, then marrying Richard, a wealthy investment banker, the promised repayment took a different form. Expensive gifts Clara didn't need. Brief visits filled with stories of important clients and luxury vacations. Phone calls that grew shorter and less frequent. Clara never complained. Mothers didn't. She was proud of her daughter's success, even as the emotional distance between them expanded like the Chicago skyline, glittering but unreachable. Then came the fall. A simple accident in her kitchen, a slip on a wet floor, and everything changed. Clara didn't call an ambulance, she called her daughter. Eleanor arrived not with concern but with determination etched into her perfectly made-up face. "This settles it, Mother. You can't live alone anymore. It was just a slip." "Dear, I'm fine. The doctor said nothing's broken." Eleanor's mouth tightened. "You need proper care. I found a place. Exclusive, the best in the city." Clara felt the first chill of fear. "I don't need a nursing home. This is where I belong." But Eleanor had already decided. 3 days later, she brought a doctor, a colleague's husband, who asked Clara questions that seemed designed to expose confusion rather than assess health. Without a proper examination, he declared she had early cognitive decline and shouldn't live independently. Papers appeared. Eleanor's manicured nail tapped impatiently on signature lines. Clara signed, too exhausted to fight, too trusting to imagine her own daughter would deceive her. The first week at Lakeview was a blur of routine medications, bland meals, and patronizing smiles. Clara's room, though advertised as luxury accommodation, felt like a hotel room where no one expected the guest to return. Her clothes had been sorted, meaning most were donated without her permission. Her cherished books remained in boxes that Eleanor promised to bring next time. Her apartment was being prepared for sale to cover the costs of her care. Each morning, Clara woke to the same beige walls and the same hollow feeling in her chest. The nurses called her dear and sweetheart, but never looked her in the eyes long enough to see the person behind the patient bracelet. They spoke about her, not to her, as though age had stolen not just her independence but her humanity. "She's one of the quiet ones," Clara overheard a young aide tell another. "Eleanor Blackwood's mother. You know, the lawyer who handled the Westlake merger? Filthy rich. You'd think she'd visit more, but Eleanor didn't visit. 3 weeks passed with only a brief phone call explaining she was swamped with a big case and would come as soon as things calmed down." It was during these lonely days that Clara met Marlene Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher with bright eyes and a rebellious streak. Unlike most residents who shuffled through their days in resigned silence, Marlene moved with purpose, smuggling in cookies, organizing impromptu poetry readings, and speaking to the staff as equals, not servants. "You're new," Marlene said, claiming the chair across from Clara in the common room one afternoon. "And you don't belong here any more than I do." Clara looked up from the window where she'd been watching birds build a nest in a nearby tree. "Pardon? You're not vacant inside," Marlene tapped her temple. "I can tell, so why are you here while your daughter lives in that mansion on Lakeshore Drive?" Clara blinked in surprise. "How do you—" "My grandson is a paralegal at Harrington and Wade. Everyone knows Eleanor Blackwood." Marlene leaned closer. "The question is, does she know you?" The question hung between them, heavy with meaning that Clara wasn't ready to face. Did Eleanor truly know her? Had she ever? "She's busy," Clara said automatically, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "She has important work." Marlene's expression softened. "More important than you?" Later that night, as Clara lay awake listening to the hum of the heating system, Marlene's question echoed in her mind. She thought of the pearl pendant against her skin, the one thing she'd insisted on keeping, not for its modest value, but for what it represented. A decision made 15 years ago, a secret kept out of instinct rather than calculation. Clara rose from her bed and went to the small desk. From her handbag, she removed an old address book and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Albert, it's Clara Wilson." She took a deep breath. "I think it's time we talked about Horizon Investments." Albert Mercer had been Clara's brother-in-law, Robert's best friend and financial advisor. When Robert died suddenly of a heart attack, Albert had helped Clara navigate the overwhelming maze of insurance forms, bank accounts, and funeral arrangements. He'd been there when she'd felt most lost. What Eleanor never knew was that Robert had a life insurance policy, not large by wealthy standards, but substantial enough that properly invested it could provide security. Clara had kept this from her daughter, initially planning to surprise her with a nest egg when she graduated college, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the way Eleanor had begun looking at her mother's simple clothes and modest home with thinly veiled embarrassment during college breaks. Perhaps it was instinct, born from years of watching pennies while others spent dollars. Whatever the reason, Clara had asked Albert to invest the money quietly under his management. "Horizon Investments is doing well," Albert told her now as they sat in a small cafe 3 blocks from Lakeview. Clara had signed herself out for a shopping trip, an independence the facility reluctantly allowed its more lucrative residents. "Better than well, actually. Your initial investment has grown considerably." Clara cupped her hands around her tea, savoring its warmth and the freedom of being outside the facility's walls. "How considerably?" Albert's eyes twinkled. "Enough that you should be living in a penthouse, not a care facility." He opened a folder, revealing figures that made Clara blink in surprise. "But there's something else you should know." He explained how Horizon had acquired properties across Chicago, including several healthcare facilities. "Including," he said meaningfully, "a controlling interest in the Lakeview residence and 3 other premium care facilities in the Midwest." Clara's teacup froze halfway to her lips. "Are you saying—" I'm saying, Clara, that you own 60% of the company that owns the place where your daughter has parked you. The teacup rattled as she set it down. I had no idea. Most silent partners don't, Albert said gently. You've let me manage everything for years, but now I think it's time you took a more active role. Clara stared out the window at the Chicago skyline, thinking of Eleanor in her corner office, of the doctor who'd declared her unfit without a proper examination, of her apartment being sold without her true consent. What would that involve exactly? Albert smiled. For starters, a board meeting. As majority shareholder, you have every right to call one. As they walked back to Lakeview, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the stirring of purpose, of righteous anger, of power. She thought of the other residents. Marlene, with her secret cookies. Frank, the retired postal worker, who talked to his dead wife each night. Sophie, who cried silently when she thought no one was watching. They deserved better. She deserved better. What would she do when Eleanor discovered the truth? The thought made her stomach tighten with both dread and a strange anticipation. For years she'd been the silent, sacrificing mother. Perhaps now it was time to be something else. Just as they reached the entrance to Lakeview, Clara's phone rang. Eleanor's name flashed on the screen. Mother, her daughter's clipped voice said without preamble, I've accepted an offer on your apartment. The new owners want to take possession next month. I'll need you to sign some final paperwork. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the pearl pendant against her skin. I see, she said quietly. When will you bring them by? I'll have my assistant drop them off tomorrow. I'm flying to New York tonight for the Westerfield case. Of course she was. Will Eleanor discover that her mother isn't as helpless as she thinks? What will happen when Clara reveals her true financial power? The stakes have just been raised and this family conflict is about to take an unexpected turn. The next morning, instead of Eleanor's promised assistant, a courier delivered a manila envelope to Clara's room at Lakeview. Inside were papers authorizing the sale of her apartment, her home for over 40 years, and a transfer of the proceeds directly to Eleanor's law firm's trust account for the management of ongoing care expenses. Clara's hands trembled as she read the fine print. No mention of her personal belongings, no accounting of how the money would be spent, just a cold legal transaction disposing of her life as though it were nothing more than a line item on a spreadsheet she didn't sign. Instead, she called Albert. Can you recommend a good lawyer? One not connected to Eleanor's firm? Albert chuckled. I know just the person. Sarah Chen. She trained under your daughter years ago before starting her own practice. Let's just say they're not on Christmas card terms anymore. Sarah arrived that afternoon, a petite woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She reviewed the papers with increasing disbelief. This is, Sarah chose her words carefully, unusually aggressive. She's liquidating your assets without proper accounting or transparency. She looked up at Clara. Did you authorize any of this? Clara shook her head. I signed admission papers. She told me they were just for the care facility. Sarah's expression hardened. That's problematic, very problematic. They spent 2 hours documenting everything. The cognitive assessment performed by Eleanor's friend, the rush to sell the apartment, the missing personal belongings. As they talked, Clara felt a strange mix of heartbreak and resolve. This was her daughter, her Ellie, who had once promised to pay her back for everything. What had happened to that girl? It's not just about the money, Clara said softly, as Sarah packed her briefcase. It's that she didn't even ask what I wanted. She just decided. Sarah's face softened. Parents and children. It's complicated. But what she's doing isn't legal or ethical. After Sarah left, Clara went to find Marlene. She needed a friend, someone who understood what it meant to be dismissed as irrelevant because of age. She found Marlene in the common room, playing chess with Frank, the retired postal worker. Well, Marlene said, studying Clara's face, you look like a woman with a plan brewing. Clara lowered her voice. What would you say if I told you I might be able to make some changes around here? Frank's gnarled hand paused over a knight. What kind of changes? Better food, more respect from the staff. Maybe even some accountability from the management. Marlene's eyes narrowed. I'd say you were either planning a revolution or you know something we don't. Clara smiled for the first time in weeks. Maybe a bit of both. That night, she called Albert again. I want to call that board meeting, and I want to audit the books of all 4 facilities. Are you sure? Albert's voice was cautious. This will put you on a collision course with your daughter. Clara touched the pearl pendant, her secret talisman. I'm sure. It's time Eleanor learned that her mother is more than just an inconvenient responsibility. The audit results arrived a week later, revealing patterns that made Clara's blood boil. Across all 4 care facilities owned by Horizon, there were systematic issues: understaffing masked by fancy amenities, medication management that prioritized sedation over proper care, and exorbitant fees for basic services. Most disturbingly, there was evidence of a tiered care system. Residents whose families paid the most received attentive care. Those with more modest means, like Frank, whose postal pension barely covered the basic rate, were routinely neglected. This isn't care, Clara told Albert as they reviewed the findings. It's exploitation. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Clara spent the days leading up to it gathering allies. Marlene introduced her to her grandson, who provided insider information about Eleanor's firm's handling of elder care contracts. Sarah Chen prepared legal documentation outlining the ethical and potentially legal violations. Clara also befriended Sophia, a shy nurse's aide who had been disciplined for wasting time talking to residents. They tell us to hurry, Sophia confided. 10 minutes per resident for morning care. If we take longer, we're written up. Would you be willing to document that? Clara asked. Sophia hesitated, then nodded. By Monday evening, Clara had assembled a dossier that would make any corporate board sweat. But as she prepared for bed, doubt crept in. This was her daughter, her only child. Was she really prepared to confront her so publicly? She took out an old photo from her bedside drawer. Eleanor at her law school graduation, arm around Clara's shoulders, both beaming with pride. Where had that connection gone? When had success transformed her daughter from the girl who promised to pay back everything to a woman who saw her mother as a burden to be managed? Clara touched the image of her daughter's face. Oh, Ellie, what happened to us? Her phone rang, startling her from her reverie. Eleanor's name flashed on the screen. Mother, her daughter's voice was tight. I just received a notice about a Horizon Investments board meeting tomorrow. Apparently someone claiming to be you has called for an audit and review of operations. A pause. What exactly do you think you're doing? Clara took a deep breath. I'm taking control of my life, Eleanor. Something you decided I wasn't capable of doing. This is ridiculous. You can't possibly understand. I understand perfectly, Clara cut in, her voice steadier than she felt. I understand that you've sold my home, taken control of my finances, and placed me in a facility that you never bothered to properly research, all while telling yourself it was for my own good. The silence on the other end was deafening. Mother, Eleanor finally said, her voice dangerously calm, you're confused. We'll discuss this tomorrow. Yes, Clara agreed, we certainly will. After hanging up, Clara sat motionless on her bed. Tomorrow would change everything. Her relationship with her daughter, her life at Lakeview, perhaps even her understanding of herself. Was she ready? After decades of being the supportive mother, could she stand her ground against the formidable woman she'd raised? In the silence of her room, Clara touched the pearl pendant at her throat and made herself a promise. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would reclaim her dignity. Not just for herself, but for Marlene, for Frank, for Sophia, and for every person who had ever been dismissed as irrelevant because of their age. What will happen when mother and daughter finally confront each other? Will Eleanor recognize the strength in the woman she so easily dismissed? The board meeting approaches, and with it a reckoning that neither woman is prepared for. The Horizon Investments boardroom occupied the top floor of a sleek, downtown Chicago skyscraper. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, its blue waters stretching toward the horizon, like possibility itself. Clara arrived early, dressed in a navy suit she'd asked Sarah to purchase for her. A far cry from the pastel sweater suits Lakeview residents were encouraged to wear. Albert greeted her at the elevator, his familiar presence steadying her nerves. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. Clara nodded, clutching her leather portfolio containing all the evidence she'd gathered. "As I'll ever be." The board members trickled in, middle-aged men in expensive suits looking puzzled at the elderly woman sitting confidently at the head of the table. The confusion deepened when Sarah Chen entered, legal files in hand. Last to arrive was Eleanor, her face a mask of professional composure betrayed only by the tight line of her mouth. She faltered momentarily when she saw Clara in the chair traditionally occupied by the board chair. "Mother," she said coolly, taking a seat at the far end of the table, "I see you've decided to make this theatrical." Clara smiled, a calm settling over her that she hadn't felt in months. "I'd call it instructional, actually." Albert called the meeting to order, introducing Clara not as Mrs. Wilson or Eleanor's mother, but as Clara Wilson, majority shareholder of Horizon Investments. The effect was immediate. The board members' expressions shifted from confusion to shock to calculation. Eleanor's perfect composure cracked, her manicured hand freezing mid-air as she reached for her water glass. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice unnaturally high. "No mistake," Clara replied, opening her portfolio. 15 years ago I received an inheritance from your Uncle Thomas. I chose to invest it privately through Albert. That investment grew into what is now Horizon Investments, which owns, among other properties, the Lakeview residence where you placed me." She distributed copies of the financial records, watching as the board members flipped through them with growing discomfort. "I've recently conducted an audit of all 4 care facilities owned by this company," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "What I found was disturbing, to say the least." For the next 30 minutes, Clara methodically presented her findings. The understaffing, the neglect, the profit-driven care models. She introduced statements from staff like Sophia, testimonials from residents, and Sarah's legal assessment of potential liability. "This," Clara concluded, "is not the type of business I wish to be associated with, nor is it the kind of care I would want for myself or anyone's parent." She turned to look directly at her daughter, whose face had gone pale. "Including yours, Eleanor?" The boardroom fell silent. Even the traffic noise below seemed to fade away as mother and daughter locked eyes across the polished table. It was Eleanor who looked away first. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Wilson?" asked one of the board members, his tone carefully respectful. Clara outlined her plan, a complete overhaul of all 4 facilities, better staff-to-resident ratios, training programs emphasizing dignity and individual care, transparent billing, community integration programs to combat isolation, and most importantly, she finished, accountability, starting today. She called for a vote. One by one, the board members, seeing which way the financial wind was blowing, sided with her. Eleanor sat frozen, watching as her carefully constructed world shifted beneath her. When the vote was complete, Clara stood. "Thank you, gentlemen. I'll expect progress reports weekly." She gathered her papers. "And now, if you'll excuse us, my daughter and I need to have a private conversation." In a small conference room down the hall, mother and daughter faced each other. For once, Eleanor seemed at a loss for words. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally asked. "Would it have mattered?" Clara countered. Eleanor flinched as if struck. "Of course it would have." "Would it? Or would you have just seen it as more money to manage for me?" Silence stretched. Between them, decades of unspoken words filling the space. "I'm not signing those apartment sale papers," Clara said quietly. "I'll be moving back home next week." Eleanor's professional mask crumbled completely. "You don't understand. I was trying to protect you." "No, Ellie, you were trying to manage me. There's a difference." For the first time in years, Clara saw a glimpse of the girl who had once promised to pay her back for everything, vulnerable, uncertain. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, her voice small. Clara hadn't expected this question, this sudden shift from the confident attorney to the daughter seeking direction. In that moment, she saw the possibility of something she'd thought lost, forever, a chance to rebuild. That, she said gently, depends on whether you're ready to know your mother as I am, not as you've imagined me to be. Clara moved back to her apartment the following week. The sale had been cancelled, the locks changed, and with Sarah Chen's help, Clara established clear legal boundaries around her finances and healthcare decisions. The apartment felt both familiar and strange, a space that had been hers for decades, yet somehow altered by her absence. She walked through each room, trailing her fingers over furniture that held the memory of her life with Robert, of raising Eleanor, of quiet evenings alone. Her books were still in boxes, her clothes still partly at Lakeview. The physical pieces of her life were scattered, much like her relationship with her daughter. Eleanor had retreated into work after the board meeting, cancelling their planned dinner with a text claiming a client emergency. Clara wasn't surprised. Her daughter had always processed emotion through work, finding comfort in the clean logic of legal briefs and corporate strategies. Give her time, Albert advised over tea in Clara's sunny kitchen. This isn't just about you asserting independence. It's about her confronting what she almost did, what she was willing to do to her own mother. Clara nodded, watching sparrows gather on her window ledge. I know, but I'm 76, Albert. Time isn't something I have in abundance. The changes at Lakeview began immediately. The director was replaced, staffing increased, and Clara established a resident council with actual authority to address concerns. She visited weekly, not as a resident but as an owner, sitting with Marlene and Frank, listening to their experiences, implementing their suggestions. "You've started a revolution," Marlene declared, delighted by the improved food and the staff's newfound attentiveness. "Not a revolution," Clara corrected, "a restoration of dignity, of voice, of community." 3 weeks after moving home, Clara received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor stood at her door, looking uncharacteristically uncertain, a large shopping bag in hand. "May I come in?" she asked formally, as if visiting a client rather than her mother. Clara stepped aside, noting the shadows under her daughter's eyes, the slight dishevelment of her usually perfect hair. They sat awkwardly in the living room, the space between them filled with unspoken words. "I brought some of your things from storage," Eleanor finally said, indicating the bag. "Books mostly. Your photo albums." "Thank you," Clara said, touched by this small gesture of recognition. Eleanor fidgeted with her watch, a nervous habit from childhood. "The changes at Lakeview, they're good. The residents seem happier." "They are. People respond to being treated as humans, not problems to manage." The words hung between them, their dual meaning unmistakable. "Mother?" Eleanor began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "I've been thinking about why I did what I did, about why I was so quick to take over." "And?" Clara prompted gently. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "I wanted to fix things, to solve a problem. So it's what I do all day with clients. Identify problems, implement solutions." She looked down at her hands. "I never stopped to consider that you weren't a problem to be solved." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the hurt she'd carried. "That's a start," she said softly. They talked for an hour, tentatively at first, then with growing openness. Eleanor spoke of the pressure of her career, her marriage to Richard that had grown distant, her fear of losing control. Clara shared stories of Eleanor's childhood that her daughter had forgotten, of the dreams she'd had beyond motherhood, of her quiet pride in the financial acumen she'd developed. As Eleanor prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Would you consider having dinner at our house on Sunday? Richard would like to see you, and maybe we could talk more." Clara nodded, hope unfurling cautiously in her heart. "I'd like that." After Eleanor left, Clara sat alone in her living room, turning the pages of the photo albums her daughter had returned. Images of their shared past. Eleanor's first day of school, birthday parties, graduations, each a marker of love and sacrifice and connection. Have you ever had to confront a family member who dismissed your capabilities or agency because of your age or circumstances? Or perhaps you know someone who has experienced this kind of well-intentioned control. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Sunday dinner at Eleanor and Richard's Lakeshore Drive mansion was a study in contrasts. The formal dining room with its crystal chandelier and hand-painted wallpaper couldn't have been more different from the cozy kitchen, where Clara had raised her daughter on simple, hearty meals. Richard greeted Clara warmly, seeming genuinely pleased to see her. "Eleanor's told me about your investment acumen," he said, pouring her a glass of wine. "I'm impressed. Most of my clients don't achieve the returns you've managed." Clara smiled, noting how Eleanor tensed slightly at her husband's easy acknowledgement of her mother's capability. "Albert deserves the credit. I just had the good sense to listen to him." Dinner conversation moved carefully around sensitive topics, focusing instead on neutral ground, a new exhibit at the Art Institute, Richard's golf game, neighborhood changes. It was pleasant but distant, like a meal shared with friendly acquaintances rather than family. As Richard cleared the dessert plates, Eleanor finally broached the subject they'd been avoiding. "I've been thinking about Lakeview and the other facilities, about the changes you're implementing." Clara nodded, waiting. "My firm represents several healthcare companies," Eleanor continued, her professional tone creeping in. "I have some insights that might be helpful. Legal considerations. For elder care facilities, compliance issues." Clara recognized what her daughter was offering, a way to reconnect through work, through the professional competence that had always been Eleanor's comfort zone. "I'd welcome your expertise," Clara said. "Perhaps you could attend the next Oversight Committee meeting." A flicker of surprise crossed Eleanor's face, as if she hadn't expected her mother to accept. Yes, I'd like that." Later, as Richard showed Clara his prized collection of first-edition books, Eleanor received a phone call. Clara watched her daughter's face transform from relaxed to tense, her voice shifting to the clipped, authoritative tone she used in legal negotiations. "I have to go to the office," Eleanor announced after hanging up. "The Wellington merger is in trouble." Richard's disappointment was evident. "Ellie, it's Sunday evening. Surely it can wait until morning." "You know it can't," Eleanor replied, already reaching for her purse. "The Tokyo market opens in a few hours. We need to get ahead of this." Clara recognized the pattern. Work as escape, as identity, as shield against messier emotional realities. She'd seen it developing when Eleanor was in law school, this retreat into professional competence whenever personal matters became too complicated. "I'll drive your mother home," Richard offered, his resigned tone suggesting this was a familiar scenario. On the drive back to her apartment, Clara studied Richard's profile. "How long has she been doing this, disappearing into work at all hours?" Richard sighed. "Years. It got worse after we lost the baby." Clara's heart stuttered. "Baby?" Richard glanced at her, surprised. "She didn't tell you. 3 years ago, a miscarriage at 5 months. The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Her daughter had lost a child, had grieved, and never told her. "She shut down afterward," Richard continued, unaware of Clara's shock. "Worked 70-hour weeks, stopped talking about trying again. When I suggested therapy, she said she was processing it in her own way." Clara gazed out at the Chicago skyline, its lights blurring through unexpected tears. There was so much she didn't know about her daughter's life, so much unshared pain. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. Richard pulled up to her building. "She's not a bad person, Clara. She's just lost somewhere inside that armor she's built." Clara touched his hand gently. "I know, she's always been too good at protecting herself." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept thinking of Eleanor, not as the cold attorney who had discarded her at Lakeview, but as a daughter grieving alone, building walls against pain, perhaps seeing in her aging mother a reminder of all that was vulnerable and fleeting. Understanding didn't erase the hurt of what Eleanor had done, but it illuminated the broken places where healing might begin. The Oversight Committee meeting for Horizon's care facilities was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon at Lakeview. Clara arrived early, taking time to visit with residents, noting improvements already evident in the brighter atmosphere and more engaged staff. Marlene cornered her in the garden, eyes sparkling with mischief. "Your daughter's here." "Arrived 20 minutes ago, looking like she's facing a firing squad." Clara smiled. Be nice, Marlene, this isn't easy for her. Good, Marlene sniffed. It shouldn't be. Not after what she did. The meeting began with progress reports from each facility's new director. Clara watched Eleanor listen intently, taking meticulous notes, occasionally asking incisive questions about regulatory compliance and staff training protocols. This was Eleanor in her element, analytical, focused, bringing order to complex situations. For the first time, Clara saw her daughter's legal prowess not as a barrier between them, but as a gift that could serve others if properly directed. When the discussion turned to resident rights and communication protocols, Eleanor leaned forward. "I'd like to propose something," she said, glancing briefly at Clara. "A legal advocacy program for residents. Many don't understand their rights or the resources available to them." Clara raised an eyebrow, pleasantly surprised. What exactly would this involve? Monthly clinics at each facility, legal advice, on healthcare directives, financial management, resident rights. My firm would provide the services pro bono. Eleanor hesitated. I'd oversee it personally. The committee approved the proposal unanimously. After the meeting, Clara found Eleanor in the garden, staring out at Lake Michigan. "That was a thoughtful proposal," Clara said, joining her daughter on the bench. Eleanor nodded, not looking at her. "It's the least I can do. Is it atonement, Ellie, or genuine interest?" Eleanor finally turned to face her mother. "Can't it be both? I did wrong by you, I know that. But I also see how many others like you are being silenced, managed, dismissed." She twisted her wedding ring nervously. "My skills could help them." Clara studied her daughter's face, the familiar determination, but also something newer, a softening around the eyes. "Richard told me about the baby," she said gently. Eleanor's breath caught. For a moment, Clara thought she might refuse to engage, might retreat behind her professional facade. Instead, her daughter's eyes filled with tears. "Her name was going to be Grace," Eleanor whispered, "after Grandma." Clara reached for her daughter's hand, and for the first time in years Eleanor didn't pull away. They sat in silence as the sun began to set over the lake, the approaching darkness softened by the first hesitant stars. In that quiet moment, between day and night, something long broken between them began ever so tentatively to mend. The advocacy program launched the following month. Eleanor came to Lakeview weekly, helping residents navigate complex legal issues, listening to their stories, learning their names. Clara sometimes observed from a distance, noting how her daughter gradually relaxed among the residents, how her professional smile slowly transformed into something more genuine. Frank, the retired postal worker, became one of Eleanor's most devoted clients. "Your daughter's got a good heart under all that fancy legal talk," he told Clara one afternoon. "Helped me get my pension situation straightened out. Wouldn't take a dime." Clara nodded, watching Eleanor across the room, head bent close to Marlene's as they reviewed some document together. "She's finding her way back," she said softly. Later that week, Richard called Clara unexpectedly. "Eleanor's been different. Since she started this advocacy program," he said. "She came home before 7 last night. We actually had dinner together, like a normal couple." "That's good," Clara replied carefully. "She talks about you," Richard continued, "about the residents, about making things right." A pause. "I haven't seen her this present in years." After they hung up, Clara stood at her apartment window, watching the city lights shimmer against the darkening sky. There was still so much unresolved between her and Eleanor, so many years of growing distance, so many unspoken hurts. But something was shifting, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. Will mother and daughter fully reconcile, or will old patterns reassert themselves? The legal advocacy program is bringing them closer, but there are still unhealed wounds. Beneath the surface, autumn arrived in Chicago with a blaze of color, transforming the lakefront parks into canvases of crimson and gold. Clara established a routine that balanced independence with new connections, mornings in her apartment with books and coffee, afternoons volunteering at a nearby elementary school or overseeing Horizon's continuing reforms, weekly dinners with Eleanor and Richard. These dinners remained somewhat formal, the conversation carefully navigating around tender spots. But occasionally, Moments of genuine connection emerged, Eleanor asking about a childhood memory, Clara sharing stories of her investment decisions, Richard bridging the gap between them with his easy warmth. One Wednesday evening in late October, Clara arrived at Eleanor's house to find her daughter alone, Richard absent on a business trip. "I thought we might order in," Eleanor said, seeming uncharacteristically nervous, "unless you'd prefer to reschedule." "This is fine," Clara assured her. They settled in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, sharing Chinese food directly from cartons, a casual intimacy that reminded Clara of Eleanor's college days, when her daughter would come home for weekends, hungry for home-cooked meals and maternal presence. After dinner, Eleanor hesitated, then said, "I'd like to show you something." She led Clara upstairs to a room Clara had never seen before, a small space at the end of the hallway, painted a soft green. It contained only a rocking chair, a small bookshelf filled with children's books, and a handcrafted wooden cradle. "The nursery?" Eleanor said quietly. "I couldn't bear to change it after we lost Grace." Clara's heart constricted at the sight of this preserved hope, this monument to loss. "Oh, Ellie." "Richard wanted to try again," Eleanor continued, running her hand along the cradle's smooth edge. "But I couldn't. I was afraid of losing another baby." Eleanor shook her head. "Of failing another person who depended on me." She looked up, meeting her mother's eyes directly. "Like I failed you." The words hung between them, raw and honest in a way their conversations hadn't been in years. "You didn't fail me, Ellie," Clara said gently. "You got lost somewhere along the way." "We both did." Eleanor sank into the rocking chair, suddenly looking very young despite her designer clothes and carefully maintained appearance. "I was so focused on being successful, on never being vulnerable the way we were after Dad died. I thought if I controlled everything perfectly, I could prevent pain." Clara knelt beside the chair, taking her daughter's hands in hers. "No one can prevent pain, sweetheart, not even brilliant attorneys." A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Apparently not." They talked more openly that night than they had in decades, about Robert's death, about the years of struggle afterward, about Eleanor's drive for success and security, about Clara's choice to keep her inheritance and investments secret. "I should have trusted you with the truth," Clara admitted, "but I watched you becoming someone who valued wealth and status above all else, and I was afraid of losing my daughter to that world completely." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And I should have seen you, really seen you, instead of just seeing a problem to solve." She squeezed her mother's hands. "I'm trying to see more clearly now with everyone." As Clara prepared to leave, Eleanor asked hesitantly, "Would you consider coming for Thanksgiving? Not just you and Richard and me, but I thought we might invite some of the residents who don't have family, Marlene, Frank, maybe a few others." Clara felt a surge of hope, not just for their relationship, but for her daughter's heart. "I think that would be wonderful." Thanksgiving Day arrived, with unexpected snow, transforming Chicago into a glittering wonderland. Clara watched from Eleanor's kitchen window as fat flakes drifted past, accumulating on the bare branches of trees and the sculptured shrubbery of the manicured garden. Behind her, the house hummed with activity. Eleanor and Richard moved efficiently around the spacious kitchen, preparing the feast. Clara had offered to help, but they gently insisted she relax. This was their gift to her and the other guests. The doorbell rang, and Richard hurried to answer it. Voices filled the entryway, Marlene's distinctive laugh, Frank's deeper tones, and the softer voice of Sophia, the nurse's aide from Lakeview, who had helped expose the facility's problems. Clara watched her daughter greet each guest warmly, taking coats, offering drinks, showing none of the stiffness that had once characterized her interactions with the residents. Eleanor had changed in these past months, softened somehow, the sharp edges of her ambition and control rounded by new perspectives. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, now made welcoming with candles and fresh flowers. As they gathered around the table, Richard raised his glass in a toast. "To new friends and reconnected family," he said, his gaze moving from Clara to Eleanor to their guests, "and to second chances." The meal progressed with easy conversation and genuine laughter. Marlene regaled them with stories of her teaching days. Frank shared memories of delivering mail through 5 decades of Chicago weather. Sophia spoke of her homeland in the Philippines and her dreams of becoming a nurse practitioner. Clara watched her daughter throughout the meal, noting how Eleanor listened intently to each speaker, her usual impatience with inefficient conversation nowhere in evidence. When Frank mentioned struggles with his grandson's college applications, Eleanor immediately offered to help review his essays. When Sophia hesitantly described her difficulty getting into nursing school despite her experience, Eleanor exchanged glances with Richard before mentioning a foundation they supported that offered scholarships. As dessert was served, Eleanor clinked her glass for attention. "I have an announcement," she said, her voice carrying a nervous edge that Clara rarely heard from her confident daughter. "Richard and I have been discussing this for several weeks, and we've made a decision." She reached for Richard's hand. "We've decided to restart the adoption process we began after we lost Grace." A chorus of congratulations erupted around the table. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes as Eleanor continued. Mother's example, her strength, her generosity, her willingness to speak truth even when it's difficult, has helped me see that there are many ways to create family, to nurture others. Eleanor's voice wavered slightly. "And that sometimes the bravest thing isn't controlling everything perfectly, but opening yourself to love despite the risks." Clara's heart swelled with a complex mixture of pride, joy, and a bittersweet acknowledgement of the difficult path that had led them here. When Eleanor met her gaze across the table, something passed between them, an understanding, a forgiveness, a recognition of both what had been lost and what might still be built. Later, as the evening wound down and guests prepared to leave, Clara found herself alone with Eleanor in the kitchen, putting away leftover food. "Did you mean what you said?" Clara asked quietly. "About my example helping you?" Eleanor set down the container she was holding and turned to face her mother fully. "Yes," she said simply. "You showed me what real courage looks like, Mother. Not the kind that wins court cases or closes deals, but the kind that stands up for dignity and truth even when it's terrifying." She hesitated, then added, "I've been so wrong about so many things, about what matters, about who you are." Clara reached out, touching her daughter's face gently. "We both made mistakes, Ellie. The question is where we go from here." Eleanor covered her mother's hand with her own. "Forward," she said firmly. "Together." Spring came late to Chicago the following year, but when it arrived, it brought profound changes. Clara's apartment building faced a major plumbing issue that required residents to relocate temporarily while repairs were made. Without discussion or debate, Eleanor and Richard invited her to stay in their guest suite. "Just for a few weeks," Eleanor assured her. "Your independence is important." Those few weeks stretched into a month, then 2. To everyone's surprise, the arrangement worked well. Clara maintained her own schedule, volunteering, overseeing Horizon's operations, meeting friends, while sharing evening meals and weekend outings with Eleanor and Richard. One rainy afternoon, Clara returned from a board meeting to find Eleanor, home unexpectedly early, sitting in the living room with a thick folder of documents. "Everything all right?" Clara asked, noting her daughter's pensive expression. Eleanor gestured to the chair opposite hers. "I've been thinking about something. I'd like your opinion." The request, so different from the daughter who once made unilateral decisions about her mother's life, warmed Clara's heart. "Of course. Horizon has been approached about acquiring another group of care facilities in Wisconsin," Eleanor explained, passing Clara a prospectus. "The current owners are retiring. The properties have potential, but they're not well managed." Clara reviewed the documents with the sharp eye she'd developed over years of quiet investing. "Interesting opportunity, but I sense there's more to this than business." Eleanor nodded. "I've been thinking about my work, about what I want the next phase of my career to look like." She hesitated. "Richard and I are proceeding with the adoption. We've been matched with a sibling group, a 6-year-old boy and his 4-year-old sister." "Ellie, that's wonderful." A genuine smile lit Eleanor's face. "It is, but it means I need to rethink my 70-hour work weeks at the firm." She tapped the folder. What if I stepped back from corporate law and focused on expanding what we've created at Horizon? Not just acquiring properties, but transforming elder care. Clara studied her daughter's face, seeing the blend of analytical sharpness and newfound compassion. You'd be extraordinary at it. We would be, Eleanor corrected. I've learned more from working with you these past months than in years. At the firm, your instincts for what people need for balancing business concerns with human dignity, I need that perspective. Clara felt a surge of emotion at this unexpected validation. Are you proposing a partnership? I am, officially. Eleanor handed her a formal document. Equal partners in a new division focused on acquisition, rehabilitation, and management of elder care facilities according to the standard we've established at Lakeview. Clara scanned the partnership agreement, noting the fair terms, the clear recognition of her experience and authority. This was not a daughter humoring an elderly mother, or a lawyer creating a symbolic role to ease guilt. This was a genuine acknowledgement of Clara's capabilities and value. What about the adoption? The children? That's the beauty of building our own company, Eleanor said, leaning forward earnestly. We create the culture, the expectations, the balance. I want these children to know their grandmother, to see women working together with respect, to understand that age doesn't diminish value. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. You've come so far, Ellie. Eleanor reached for her mother's hand, and we both have. 2 weeks later, Clara signed the partnership agreement. The same day, Eleanor and Richard received confirmation that the adoption would proceed. Michael and Sophie would join their family in July. As Clara prepared to return to her now-repaired apartment, she found herself reluctant to leave. The guest suite had become more than temporary housing. It had become a place of reconciliation and new beginnings. You know, Richard said as he helped her pack her books, we have that carriage house on the property. It's just sitting there since my mother decided Florida was more to her liking. Clara looked up, surprised. What are you suggesting? Your own space, your own entrance, but close enough for family dinners and helping with the children. He shrugged. Just a thought. That evening, Clara raised the subject with Eleanor, expecting resistance. Her daughter had always valued clear boundaries and separate spaces. Instead, Eleanor considered the idea thoughtfully. Would you want that? To be so close to our chaos? I think, Clara said carefully, I would like to be close enough to help without intruding, to be present without imposing. Eleanor nodded slowly. The children would benefit from knowing you, from your stories, your perspective. And you? Would it be too much having me so near after all these years apart? Eleanor's eyes held a new softness as she regarded her mother. I think I've finally learned that some distances can't be measured in feet and yards. 5 years passed in what seemed like moments. The carriage house became Clara's domain, a perfect balance of independence and connection. She had her own garden, her own routines, her own friends, but also easy access to family dinners, weekend outings, and the daily joys of watching Michael and Sophie grow. Horizon Elder Care Partners flourished under Clara and Eleanor's joint leadership. They acquired and transformed 12 facilities across the Midwest, implementing their model of respectful, dignity-centered care. Industry leaders began consulting them on best practices. Universities invited them to speak about ethical business models in healthcare. Clara, now 81, had scaled back her day-to-day involvement, but remained the company's moral compass. The voice that always asked, how does this serve the residents? How does this honor their humanity? On a golden September afternoon, Clara sat on her patio watching Eleanor and Richard play soccer with the children in the main house's sprawling backyard. Michael, now 11, had his father's athletic build and his adoptive mother's sharp mind. Sophie, 9, combined artistic sensitivity with a fierce determination that reminded Clara of Eleanor at the same age. They were beautiful together. This family forged not from blood alone, but from choice, from healing, from the willingness to see each other anew. The gate between their yards opened, and Eleanor walked through, carrying a tray with lemonade and cookies. The warriors need refreshment, she said, settling beside Clara on the patio love seat, and I needed a moment of quiet. Clara smiled. Parenthood isn't for the faint of heart. You made it look easy, Eleanor said, reaching for her mother's hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over the years. It wasn't, Clara replied honestly, but it was worth every moment. They watched Richard organizing the children for another game, his patient voice carrying across the yard. I've been thinking, Eleanor said after a comfortable silence, about what to tell the children about how things were between us before. Clara considered this. The truth, I think, an age-appropriate version, that even people who love each other deeply can lose their way sometimes, that pride and fear can create distance, but that love, if it's real, offers second chances. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, and third and fourth chances. As many as we need, Clara agreed. Later that evening, after a family dinner in the main house, Clara returned to her carriage house. The autumn air carried a slight chill, prompting her to wrap a shawl around her shoulders as she settled on her patio to watch the stars emerge. Her phone chimed with a text from Eleanor. The children want to know if you'll come read them a story before bed. Clara smiled, typing back, On my way. On. As she crossed the garden between their homes, Clara touched the pearl pendant she still wore, the talisman that had once represented her secret strength, her hidden power. Now it symbolized something different, the quiet wisdom of patience, the courage to speak truth, the resilience to begin again. The light from Eleanor's house spilled onto the lawn, golden and inviting. Inside, voices called her name, not Mrs. Wilson or the resident in room 212, but Grandma Clara, spoken with love and expectation. She had come full circle. Once abandoned, now embraced. Once silenced, now heard. Once merely tolerated, now essential. Clara quickened her steps toward the waiting warmth, toward the family that had been lost and found again, toward the future they would continue building together, day by day, story by story, love by love. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments. So that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.